Beware the smiling shadow, Carl Jung's hidden warning about people. There's a strange kind of person we've all encountered. They smile often. They say the right things. They seem agreeable, helpful, even warm. But something about them feels off. You can't quite explain it. They haven't done anything overtly wrong. In fact, they may be popular, well-liked, and even admired. But deep down, you sense a duplicity, a performance being played out behind a mask. We tend to ignore this instinct. We tell ourselves not to be suspicious, not to overthink, not to judge. But Carl Jung would urge us to listen carefully, because beneath that smile may lie the most dangerous kind of darkness, the kind that hides in plain sight. This is the smiling shadow. And it's not just about other people. It's also about us. Jung's psychology wasn't just about trauma or mental health. It was about the soul. He believed that every human being carries a shadow, the unconscious part of the psyche that holds everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. It includes our anger, our envy, our arrogance, our cruelty, but also, paradoxically, our hidden potential. The shadow isn't inherently evil. It's simply what's repressed. But when ignored, it festers. And here's the terrifying part. The more we suppress it, the more it manipulates us from the background, shaping our decisions, our reactions, and, most dangerously, our relationships. This is where the smiling shadow emerges. Not as a monster, but as a charming mask worn by someone who has never dared to face their inner truth. Someone who has built their entire identity around appearing good while secretly being ruled by what they refuse to confront. We all do this to some extent. We all wear masks. We all perform. But some people make the performance their entire existence. They become personas, hollow vessels of social approval. They say all the right things, but their words are disconnected from their soul. They appear empathic, but their kindness is transactional. They project virtue, but only because they've buried the parts of themselves they believe are unworthy or dangerous. Jung warned, the greater the light, the darker the shadow. In other words, the more someone seems excessively virtuous, the more you should pay attention not to what they say, but to what they avoid. What do they laugh off? What do they never admit? What do they project onto others?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Let's go deeper. Why do people become the smiling shadow? Why do they deny parts of themselves so completely that they must live behind a mask? The answer lies in fear, deep, primal fear of rejection, abandonment, punishment. From childhood, we are conditioned to be good. We're praised when we obey, when we please, when we suppress our inconvenient emotions. Over time, we learn to exile parts of ourselves that don't match the image others reward. But those exiled parts don't disappear. They go underground. They become the unconscious shadow. And if we never do the work of integration, they begin to leak out in harmful ways through passive aggression, manipulation, self-sabotage, or even cruelty disguised as morality. Think about this. Have you ever met someone who weaponizes kindness? Who uses their niceness as a tool for control? Who makes you feel guilty not because they're angry, but because they're disappointed in a way that shames you? That's the smiling shadow at work. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't attack, it seduces. It doesn't push you away. It makes you dependent on its approval and terrified of its withdrawal. Jung knew this type intimately. He saw it in society, in institutions, in religions, And yes, in therapists and healers too. The people most obsessed with being good are often those least in touch with their darkness. But let's not just point fingers outward, but let's ask the harder question: where is the smiling shadow alive in me? Where am I performing goodness to avoid conflict or rejection? Where am I manipulating others with my politeness, my helpfulness, my virtue? This is where the work begins, because Jung's warning wasn't just about being cautious of others, it was about becoming radically honest with ourselves. Not to shame ourselves, but to free ourselves, because the shadow isn't a curse. It's a map. It shows us what we've denied, and thus what we need to reclaim if we want to become whole. The smiling shadow is dangerous not because it's evil, but because it's unconscious. And unconsciousness, when left unchecked, becomes destructive. It creates relationships based on illusion. It breeds resentment masked as sacrifice. It turns parenting into control, leadership into narcissism, and love into possession. The smiling shadow doesn't want connection, it wants domination through charm. And the only way to disarm it is through awareness. Through the courage to look into our own darkness and say, yes, that's me too. Here's the paradox: the more we integrate our shadow, the less threatening we become. Not because we're nicer, but because we're real. We no longer need to manipulate others to maintain an image. We can be direct, honest, grounded. And that authenticity disarms the smiling shadow in others too. It creates space for real connection, messy, imperfect, but true. So beware the smiling shadow, not to become paranoid, but to become wise. And beware the ways you may be smiling to hide your own wounds. Jung's hidden warning wasn't to make us fear others. It was to awaken us to the masks we all wear and to invite us into the deeper, more mysterious work of becoming whole. The masks we marry, how the smiling shadow shapes our closest relationships. If you want to see the smiling shadow in its most seductive form, don't look at strangers. Look at the people you love. Look at your partner, your friend group, maybe even your family. But more importantly, look at yourself within those relationships. Because here's the harsh truth Carl Jung uncovered: we don't fall in love with people, we fall in love with their mask, their persona, the version of them that confirms our expectations, soothes our wounds, or mirrors our ideal image. And they do the same with us. So what happens when two people fall in love not with each other, but with each other's masks? The relationship becomes a stage play. And behind the curtain, the shadow grows stronger. At first, it feels magical. They say all the right things. They get you. You feel seen, validated, wanted. But what you're really seeing is a carefully curated projection, both theirs and yours. What you're really feeling is the temporary euphoria of mutual idealization. But then something shifts. Maybe they get irritated over something small. Maybe they withdraw. Maybe they show a side of themselves that contradicts the role they were playing. And suddenly the mask slips. You see a glimpse of their shadow, and they see yours. That's the moment most relationships begin to crack, not because something went wrong, but because something real finally emerged. But Jung taught that we unconsciously project our shadow onto others, especially those closest to us. Why? Because it's safer to see our disowned traits in someone else than to admit they live in us. So if you've buried your anger, you'll be hypersensitive to it in your partner. If you've suppressed your need for control, you might label them as controlling. If you've never acknowledged your fear of abandonment, You might accuse them of being too needy, when really it's your own fear mirrored back at you. The smiling shadow thrives in this dynamic. It keeps us locked in roles: rescuer and victim, caretaker and child, pursuer and avoidant, while the deeper truth remains hidden. But here's the real tragedy. We don't just deceive others, we deceive ourselves. We convince ourselves that we're being good partners, supportive friends, or patient siblings, when really we're controlling, enabling, or avoiding. We use politeness to dodge conflict. We use sacrifice to gain power. We use silence as a weapon. And then we wonder why our relationships feel hollow, tense, or unfulfilling. The smiling shadow is tricky like that. It doesn't storm in with fire and destruction. It smiles. It says, "I'm just doing what's best for both of us." It pretends to serve love while secretly serving fear. Here's a question that will shake the foundation of any relationship. Would the people closest to you still love you if you dropped the mask? If you stopped performing, stopped pleasing, stopped suppressing your truth, what would remain? Would you still be chosen? Would they? This question isn't meant to create panic. It's meant to invite clarity. Because until we're willing to show up as our whole selves shadow, and all, we're not actually in a relationship. We're in a performance. And no performance can last forever without cracking. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of inner work before, during, and even after our most intimate relationships. Because if we don't confront our own shadow, we'll keep recreating the same dynamics, just with different faces. We'll marry the mask, then resent the reality. We'll chase connection, but sabotage intimacy. We'll say we want truth, but punish each other for being honest. The only way out is through the discomfort of self-examination, through the pain of owning our projections, through the humility of saying, "This part of me scares me too." And when we do that, when we start relating from authenticity instead of performance, something incredible happens. The relationship deepens, not always immediately, not always smoothly, but it becomes real. You stop needing each other to be perfect. You start allowing each other to be whole. You stop clinging to the fantasy and start loving the flawed, evolving human being in front of you. And in doing so, you invite them to love you, not the mask, but the truth of who you are. So be careful who you idealize. Be careful who you demonize. Both are projections. Look instead for those who are willing to show their imperfections, who are honest about their limits, who can say, "I don't have it all together," and mean it. Those are the people who have begun the work of integrating their shadow. Those are the people who can love from wholeness, not from lack. Carl Jung's hidden warning was never just psychological, it was relational. When we ignore the shadow, our relationships become illusions. When we face it, our relationships become mirrors. And in those mirrors, we don't just find the other, we find ourselves. The collective mask, how society rewards the smiling shadow and punishes the real. If you've ever felt like the world punishes honesty and rewards performance, and you're not imagining it, we live in a culture that doesn't just tolerate the smiling shadow, it promotes it. It makes it profitable. It makes it admirable. From the moment we're old enough to speak, we are taught subtly, consistently to wear a mask. Say what's polite, not what's true. Smile even when it hurts. Perform confidence even when you're crumbling inside. And if you can do all that while achieving visible success, society applauds you. But not because it sees your soul. Society applauds the mask. And that's the danger. Carl Jung warned that the persona, the socially acceptable self we present to the world, was necessary but deeply risky. Necessary because we cannot function without it. Risky because if we identify too closely with it, we forget who we are underneath. And nowhere is this confusion more apparent than in modern society. Think about the influencers, the executives, the leaders, the public figures who seem flawless on the surface. They radiate control, charm, discipline. But how often do we hear the same story? The collapse behind the scenes, the addiction, the breakdown, the secret rage. These aren't personal failures, but they're the result of a system that demands the mask and punishes the truth. We don't just reward the smiling shadow, we build systems around it. Schools that grade conformity over creativity, workplaces that promote politeness over authenticity, social media platforms that turn identity into a brand. Even in spirituality, we see this pattern. People performing enlightenment, performing compassion, and performing depth. But what happens when you're rewarded more for looking wise than for actually being wise? You create a culture where people bypass their real pain, their real questions, their real darkness, and replace it with a curated, hollow light, a mask of virtue, a smile that hides the scream. And here's the part that hurts: we all participate in this. Not because we're evil, but because we're afraid of being rejected, misunderstood, excluded. So we trade truth for belonging. We trade depth for approval. We trade self for image. And then we wonder why we feel so disconnected, not just from others, but from ourselves. Jung would say this is the cost of collective shadow suppression. When an entire society refuses to face what's real, it creates a culture of pathology, a culture where people appear well but are spiritually starving, where everyone is performing but no one is connecting. Ask yourself, when was the last time you said something true, even though it felt risky? When was the last time you let someone see your fear, your confusion, your anger without wrapping it in a joke or an apology? If the answer is not recently, you're not alone. But you are starving. Starving for realness, for other people's truth, for your own. And this is where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. The shadow isn't just personal, it's collective. And if we want to heal individually, we must challenge the cultural systems that reward the mask and exile the soul. So what can we do? How do you live authentically in a world that punishes authenticity? You start small. You start with the moment you want to lie to make someone comfortable, and you pause. You start with the smile that doesn't feel real, and you ask yourself, what am I hiding? You start with the pressure to post the perfect image, and instead, you share something true, even if it's messy. You risk discomfort. You risk rejection. And in doing so, you reclaim your integrity. Because here's the paradox: the more real you become, the more you threaten the system, but the more you liberate everyone trapped inside it. Your honesty gives others permission. Your courage creates space. Your authenticity becomes a quiet rebellion against the smiling shadow that dominates our culture. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, we begin to remember what it means to be human again. Carl Jung wasn't just giving us tools for personal growth, he was handing us a mirror to society. A mirror that reveals how deeply we have confused performance for presence, image for essence, persona for person. And his hidden warning echoes louder now than ever: if we keep rewarding the mask, we will forget the face. If we keep worshipping the smile, we will lose the soul. So the choice is ours. Do we continue to play along, to polish the mask and hope no one ever sees behind it? Or do we begin the harder work, the sacred work of peeling it off and facing the shadow within and around us? The shadow's gift, how embracing darkness leads to inner liberation. It's easy to fear the shadow. It's easy to think of it as dangerous, destructive, something to be avoided or cured. But Carl Jung never saw it that way. In fact, the shadow is not the enemy, it's the unlived life. It's everything we've hidden, denied, and disowned, not because it's evil, but because we were too afraid to integrate it. And here's the truth that turns everything upside down. Our freedom, our authenticity, our deepest peace doesn't come from avoiding the shadow, it comes from embracing it. The smiling shadow, the one that hides behind politeness and perfection, keeps us trapped. But the raw, honest shadow, the one we meet face to face when we stop pretending, holds a gift more powerful than any performance ever could. The gift is wholeness. When you begin to accept the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime running from, your anger, your envy, your control, your fear, you stop being at war with yourself. You stop needing to dominate others to feel powerful. You stop needing to impress others to feel worthy. In short, you come home to yourself. And that is the deepest kind of liberation. Because most people are not suffering from a lack of love or success, they're suffering from a lack of inner alignment. They've built lives on top of masks. They've achieved goals that don't reflect their soul. They've surrounded themselves with people who only know the performance, not the person. But when you integrate the shadow, you begin to live from the inside out. Your actions are no longer reactions, but your choices are no longer based on fear. Your identity is no longer a brand, it's a living, breathing truth. You can say no without guilt. You can say yes without fear. You can sit in discomfort without needing to escape it. And most powerfully, you can hold space for others' darkness without needing to fix, shame, or rescue them. That's what makes integrated people magnetic, not because they're perfect, but because they're real. And in a world full of masks, reality is rare and irresistible. But let's not pretend this path is easy. Embracing the shadow means facing pain. It means revisiting the wounds you tried to forget. It means owning the parts of you that don't fit the narrative you've built. It means saying, yes, sometimes I am selfish. Sometimes I manipulate. Sometimes I pretend to be better than I am, but not to drown in shame, but to rise in truth. Because only when we stop lying to ourselves can we begin to live honestly with others. Think of it like this: the shadow is a locked room in your psyche. Inside that room is everything you thought you had to hide to be loved. But if you're brave enough to open the door, you don't just find darkness, you find power, creativity, clarity, fire. It's not about unleashing chaos. It's about reclaiming the raw energy you buried just to survive. And when that energy is integrated, it becomes a force for love, for change, for presence. That's the shadow's gift. So ask yourself this one last time: what part of me have I most feared becoming? And what if that part, when brought into the light, could become my greatest strength? This is not a rhetorical question. It's the key to your freedom, because the person you're trying to become is not found in the mask. It's found in the parts of you you've been told are too much, too dark, too dangerous. But Jung knew what we all must come to know: those parts are not your curse. They are your calling. And so, beware the smiling shadow, not to run from it, but to recognize it. In others, yes, but first in yourself. Because when you stop fearing your darkness, you stop fearing life itself. You stop fearing love. You stop fearing death. You stop fearing your own soul. And in that moment, you are no longer a prisoner of the persona. You become whole. You become free. You become real. That's the hidden warning Jung left behind, not to terrify us, but to awaken us. And now the question is yours to answer. Will you keep polishing the mask? Or will you finally open the door to the truth within? The shadow is waiting, but so is your freedom.